I noticed in a recent issue of the local newspaper that the Broadway Palm, a dinner theater in Fort Myers, will be staging a production of the musical Footloose this summer. If you're not familiar with it, it's a show that's based on a true story from a small town in Oklahoma. It has a couple of infectious tunes and reflects the reality that, largely in the past, there were certain towns and villages that banned dancing, usually for religious reasons. The show, Footloose, tells the story of a young student named Ren McCormick, who moves from Chicago with his single mother to the small town of Beaumont. One of the great joys in Ren's life is dancing. But when he gets to Beaumont, he discovers that the town council has banned both rock music and dancing of any kind. As the story unfolds, Ren falls for a young woman named Ariel, who happens to be the daughter of the Reverend Shaw Moore, who is the moral force behind the town council's decision about dancing and rock music. Reverend Moore learns of Ariel's relationship with Ren, and he forbids her from seeing him. Meanwhile, Ren starts to agitate for a change in the town ordinance so that he and his classmates can hold a senior prom. You can't have a prom without music and dance. The pivotal scene in the show takes place at a town council meeting where Ren makes an impassioned plea for changing the rule about dancing and allowing the seniors to have their prom. He even quotes various Bible passages to bolster his point that dancing is not immoral, but rather something that God approves of. The town council disagrees and votes to uphold the ban on dance. I'll stop there in case you haven't seen the show or the movie and encourage you to watch the film on DVD or the show at Broadway Palm. I think it's worth your time to mull over the messages that are imparted. Meanwhile, let me note that one of the passages Ren refers to, a passage often cited to support the validity of dance, is the one that Eric read earlier from 2 Samuel. If David, the great king of Israel, could dance, and dance in the context of worshiping God, why can't we? Asks Ren. But let's back up a minute. Why was David dancing in the first place? And why in front of the ark of the Lord? For that matter, just what is the ark of the Lord? We all know it has something to do with Harrison Ford, maybe. Well, first of all, let's make sure everybody's clear. We're not talking about the Ark of Noah and pairs of animals escaping 2 by 2 in the Great Flood. This ark, for all intents and purposes, is a box, a great, big, ornate, decorated box, a box suspended between 2 poles so that it can be carried by 2 men. Inside the box, it was said to contain the 2 stone tablets upon which the 10 Commandments had been inscribed. The ark, however, was not just a piece of holy luggage. It wasn't just some sort of divine footlocker. No, the ark was said to represent the presence of God, God's self. Where the ark was, there God was said to reside. Many years later, when the great temple was built in Jerusalem, it was the ark that was placed in the Holy of Holies, the centermost, holiest part of the temple. Meanwhile, however, when there was no temple, it was a portable device, literally, and it traveled from place to place to place. Where the king was, there the ark was, and where the ark was, there God was said to be present. Sort of like the way some people view their cell phones. After David had become king, and as he sought to consolidate his power over the 12 tribes of Israel, he chose a new city to be the capital. Not what had been the capital under Saul, but a capital that was in the central part of the country, halfway between the powerful tribes in the north and the powerful tribes in the south. And that city was the city of Jerusalem. Then David had the ark brought into the city. That's the story that Eric read for us. It was brought into the city not only as a symbol of God's presence, but in some way it was believed to actually make possible God's presence. When the ark finally arrives in Jerusalem, it's as if God, God's self, had shown up. And David is overjoyed. And in his great joy, he celebrates, he worships. He and those who are with him, they dance before the Lord with all their might, says the writer of our text, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals, with shouting and with the sound of a trumpet. With all their might, with all they had to bring to bear, they celebrated. God was with them. And David danced. But not everyone was happy about all of this. In particular, one of David's wives, Michal, is very distressed by all the leaping and dancing and celebration, really distressed. So upset that as she watches her husband out the palace window, she spits and sputters. And, says the writer, she despised David in her heart. Did you ever really kick up your heels at a party only to get scolded by your spouse once you got home for making a real fool of yourself? Well, that essentially is what happens to David. In the verse that follows this morning's passage, after what Eric read for us, we learn that when the celebration is over and everybody's gone home, David's wife, Michal, explodes. Here you are the king, she says, and you acted like a total jackass out there, dancing around in your shorts. All he had on was his ephod. What a disgrace. And you call yourself king. I'm not making this stuff up. You can read the verses for yourself. Many scholars believe that this scene is more than just the report of a royal domestic squabble. Michal, you need to know, is the daughter of David's predecessor, the late King Saul, whom ultimately David had defeated. And Michal's relationship with David, as you can imagine, is long and complicated. It was, after all, a marriage of convenience. It was trying to bring together powerful General David and the king's daughter. It was a PR move on Saul's part. Imagine how Michal probably felt right from the start about it. There probably is no real love between the two of them at this point in the story. This might, as scholar Walter Brueggemann puts it, represent a real shift in power. Saul's royal line has come to an end. There are none of his descendants to take the throne. David is on the throne. So Saul's line is done and over, period. And despite her loyalty to the memory of her father, there is nothing that Michal can do. She must accept the truth that the future now lies with David. That's one way to look at this story. However, there's another way to look at this passage, and they're not mutually exclusive. There's another way to understand Michal's reaction. This may be very much a matter of taste. Michal may be upset because of the way David has behaved, because of what he's done in this royal and sacred setting. She may be upset because, from her perspective, as another scholar writes, what David has done is inappropriate for a king. Perhaps as a royal herself, she has her own conception of protocol. And David, this son of a shepherd, does not meet the standard. She doesn't like what he's done because what he's done, she feels, is inappropriate for worship and is inappropriate for a king. A king shouldn't do that, and especially in worship. Now, all of which may seem totally irrelevant to you and your life. After all, neither you nor I are royalty, I don't think. I mean, somebody out there may be, and I just don't know about it. We don't understand God's presence to be carted around in some fancy box. We live in the modern world, not in ancient Israel. So what has any of this to do with us anyway? Lots, actually. For while we may not live in the ancient world, like Michal, we may have some pretty set ideas about what makes for proper protocol. We may have some very fixed notions about the right way to worship. Let's begin with things like dance. I'm not suggesting that we become like the Shakers of old and make dancing a central part of our worship. But who's to say using our bodies to express our joy at God's goodness and grace is somehow wrong? Yet people say that and believe that, in part probably because of stories like the one we heard from Mark, where dance is used for nefarious purposes. I've heard people say things like, pagan, it's too pagan, it's too primitive, it doesn't belong in worship. Yet for millennia, many people in many religious traditions, including Christianity, have used dance to express their deepest thoughts and feelings about God. Or what about the visual arts? In the Reformation, folks inspired by Luther and Calvin went through their churches and overturned statues, threw out paintings, destroyed various visual expressions of faith. Such things were said to smack of idolatry. Later in New England and other places as well, new church buildings were erected that were as plain and as unadorned as possible. For the right way to worship was understood to be the way free of anything visual. Yet over the centuries, millions of Christians have been drawn closer to God by statues of Mary, tapestries depicting the Last Supper, stained glass windows adorned with images of the saints, and other visual expressions of faith. And what about music? So many people, trust me, have such strong opinions about what makes for the right kind of music for worship. How often I hear someone say, we should only sing the old hymns, usually meaning hymns written in the last half of the 19th century. Something like Gregorian chant, which is really old church music, just wouldn't be right, too Catholic. And moving chronologically in the opposite direction, there are those who feel using guitars and drums in worship is a real abomination. They have no place in the sanctuary, such folks feel, no place in a service of worship. Yet all types of music speak to all types of people and help them to be more in tune, so to speak, with the Holy One. In a blog post from earlier this year, Nancy Janisch writes, "There is no proper way to do personal devotions." I agree, but I would amplify that. I would go so far as to say, there is no proper way to do public devotions, what we call worship. There are so many ways that we can draw closer to God. Why limit ourselves to only a few? As Janice writes, sing, chant, read out loud, draw, kneel, stand, dance, sit, watch the sunrise. Do whatever brings you into God's presence. Because we don't believe God is only present in a box that we carry around. That, for me, is the bottom line. Our worship, personal and private, or corporate and public, should be that which brings us into God's presence. Hear me again. Our worship should be that which brings us into a fuller awareness of God's presence. There is no right way to worship. There is no wrong way to worship. You may not like a particular style. It may not work for you, and that's perfectly okay. We all have different tastes, but that doesn't make it wrong. It's not a matter of morality. Because you don't like 19th century hymns doesn't make you a bad person and doesn't make for bad worship. because you can't stand rap music, it doesn't make it bad that some folks use it in worship. It's not good and bad. It's not right and wrong. In fact, I would suggest the only thing that is wrong is to be like the town council in Footloose, or to be like Michael in our story from 2 Samuel, sitting on the sidelines and passing judgment on how others worship. So what is it that brings you closer to God? What draws you more fully into the presence of the holy? Whatever that may be, might you have the energy and enthusiasm of David as you worship the Holy One. Might you leap and dance with great joy as you stand in the presence of the Lord of the dance. Amen. Sisters and brothers, are you part of a couple, or have you been? If you are, and you decide to go to the movies with a couple of other couples, you know and I know the hardest part of that evening is deciding which movie to go to. And you know and I know that part of the reality is that some of the 6 people are going to really love the movie, and some are going to say, I'd never have gone to that on my own, but I'm going because I want to spend this time with my friends, because I want to be part of the community, because sometimes my taste isn't what's most important. Now, worship isn't going to the movies. I understand that. In many ways, it's far more important. But there are a lot more than 6 people here, and if we move into season, many more than 6. And our worship bridges many styles. And some Sundays it'll work, and some Sundays it won't. And some Sundays you'll love every hymn, and some Sundays you won't know any hymns. And sometimes the scripture reading will strike you over the head, and sometimes you'll walk away scratching your head. And sometimes the sermon will be good, and sometimes you'll fall asleep. But we are all here to rise above our individual tastes and to share together the corporate experience of being in God's presence. And while your foot may not tap, you can take joy in the tapping foot of your neighbor down the pew. And while you may not weep at a particular prayer, you can take great comfort in knowing that you're there for the one who does. Worship is not a matter of taste. How we worship may be, but the worship itself is this God-given opportunity for us to stand and sit and dance and sing and be together in God's presence. Might that work for you more often than not. Amen.